The Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Service auditorium was filled with diplomats, academics, and policy experts as two of the most compelling political figures prepared for what had been billed as a dialogue on leadership and democratic change in the 21st century. Former President Barack Obama, at 63, remained one of the most respected voices in global politics, known for his eloquent advocacy of democratic institutions and incremental reform. President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, at 34, had become Africa's most controversial leader through his revolutionary policies and direct challenge to Western political orthodoxy. The visual contrast was striking. Obama, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with his signature calm dignity, embodied the sophisticated incrementalism that had defined his political career. Traore, in his simple brown military-style uniform, projected the quiet intensity of someone who had chosen action over rhetoric and results over procedure. President Traore, Obama began with his characteristic thoughtful cadence. "I want to start by acknowledging the genuine desire for change that motivates your leadership. The aspiration to improve people's lives is fundamental to any legitimate governance, and I respect the passion you bring to that mission." The opening was vintage Obama, diplomatic, respectful, but carrying an implicit, however, that suggested constructive criticism would follow. That said, I think it's crucial that we discuss not just our goals as leaders, but the methods we employ to achieve those goals. History teaches us that sustainable change requires building broad coalitions, respecting institutional processes, and ensuring that all voices are heard in the democratic conversation. The framing was subtle but clear. Obama was positioning himself as the voice of wisdom and experience against what he perceived as Traore's impulsive radicalism. "President Obama," Traore replied with respectful courtesy, "I appreciate your acknowledgement and welcome this opportunity to explore the relationship between methods, outcomes, and the actual welfare of the people we serve." His tone was measured but carried an undertone suggesting he wouldn't be intimidated by Obama's international stature or rhetorical sophistication. "You mentioned the importance of sustainable change through institutional processes. Could you help me understand what you consider sustainable when people are facing immediate threats to their survival and dignity?" The question was polite but pointed, immediately shifting the conversation from abstract principles to urgent human realities. Obama leaned forward slightly, adopting the professorial manner that had made him famous. "Well, I think the civil rights movement in America provides an excellent example of how patient organizing, legal challenges, and gradual expansion of democratic participation can achieve lasting transformation. These approaches take longer, yes, but they create change that can withstand political shifts and maintain social cohesion. Revolutionary approaches, while appealing in their immediacy, often create instability that ultimately harms the very people they're intended to help." The historical parallel was carefully chosen to illustrate Obama's preferred model of institutional reform over revolutionary action. "That's an interesting perspective," Traore acknowledged thoughtfully. "But I'm curious about the time frame you consider acceptable for addressing urgent needs. How long should a mother wait for healthcare reform while her child suffers from preventable disease? How long should a student delay education while institutions debate gradual improvements?" The questions were simple but cutting, forcing Obama to defend incrementalism against immediate human suffering. "President Traore," Obama responded, his tone becoming slightly more lecturing, "I understand the emotional appeal of wanting immediate results. But governance requires balancing urgency with sustainability, passion with prudence. When you bypass democratic institutions, even with noble intentions, you risk establishing precedents that can be exploited by leaders with less virtuous motivations. You're essentially asking people to trust your judgment rather than giving them meaningful participation in decisions that affect their lives." The criticism was diplomatically phrased but clear. Obama was characterizing Traore's approach as potentially authoritarian despite its benevolent goals. "President Obama," Traore replied, his voice gaining a subtle edge, "you speak about giving people meaningful participation in decisions. But what constitutes meaningful participation when the systems themselves are designed to prevent the outcomes people actually need? Obama looked slightly puzzled, not having expected such a direct philosophical challenge. In Burkina Faso, we inherited a democracy where elections were systematically rigged, opposition was marginalized, and policy was dictated by international financial institutions rather than citizen preferences. The previous government held power for decades through processes you would call democratic, while our people remained among the poorest in the world. So when you advocate for institutional processes, you're essentially asking people to participate in systems designed to ignore their voices while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. The logic was uncomfortable for Obama, as it challenged not just Traore's methods but the fundamental assumptions underlying democratic theory in post-colonial contexts. President Traore, Obama said, his tone becoming more direct, I think you're conflating legitimate criticism of flawed systems with justification for abandoning democratic principles altogether. Yes, many democracies have imperfections, but the solution is reform, not replacement with military governance. But how do you reform systems when those same systems control the mechanisms for change? Traore asked immediately. If elections are manipulated, media controlled, and policy predetermined by foreign creditors, what democratic avenues exist for meaningful transformation? The logical trap was becoming apparent, and Obama was struggling to provide a convincing answer that didn't sound like he was defending obviously corrupt arrangements. Look, Obama said, his composure showing the first signs of strain, I've spent my entire career working within democratic institutions to achieve change. It's slow, it's frustrating, it requires compromise, but it produces results that last because they have legitimacy and broad support. What you're proposing is a shortcut that might produce immediate improvements but undermines the foundations of accountable governance. What happens when the next military leader has different priorities? What protections do people have then? The argument was Obama's strongest, concern about precedent and the potential for future abuse of power. That's a fair concern, Traore acknowledged. But let me ask you about the precedent set by democratic leaders who consistently fail to deliver meaningful improvements for their people. You had 8 years as President of the United States, with significant public support and enormous resources. What concrete transformations did you achieve for the communities most affected by systemic inequality? The question was direct and personal, forcing Obama to defend his own record against someone who had achieved rapid, substantial change in far more challenging circumstances. Obama's expression tightened, clearly uncomfortable with having his presidential legacy questioned in this context. President Traore, I think you're oversimplifying both the achievements of my administration and the constraints that democratic leaders face in complex political systems. Am I oversimplifying? Traore interrupted gently. Or am I asking you to explain why procedural constraints should be considered more important than human outcomes? Healthcare reform that left millions uninsured. Financial regulations that preserved the power of the same institutions that created economic crises. Climate policies that failed to meaningfully reduce emissions despite overwhelming scientific consensus about urgency. The systematic critique was clearly frustrating Obama, as it used his own record to challenge his fundamental beliefs about democratic governance. President Obama, you had more institutional power and resources than any African leader could imagine, yet you delivered incremental adjustments to unjust systems rather than the transformative change your supporters expected. Meanwhile, in 2 years with far fewer resources, I've provided free healthcare to every citizen, eliminated educational costs, nationalized key industries, and increased government revenues by 400%. Which approach has actually served people's needs more effectively? Obama was now visibly struggling, his usual confidence shaken by someone who was using concrete achievements to challenge abstract democratic theory. President Traore, Obama said, his voice carrying a new note of frustration, I think what we're witnessing here is the fundamental difference between someone who understands the complexities of sustainable governance and someone who is new to the real challenges of leadership. The condescension was unmistakable, framing their disagreement as a matter of experience rather than principled differences about priorities and methods. Democratic governance requires patience, wisdom, and understanding of diverse stakeholder interests. It demands building consensus rather than imposing solutions, even when those solutions might seem obviously correct to well-intentioned leaders. Obama was now fully in lecture mode, his tone suggesting he was educating someone who simply didn't grasp the sophistication required for real leadership. What you're calling revolutionary efficiency might look quite different after you've gained more experience navigating the genuine complexities of governing diverse populations with competing interests and limited resources. The implication was clear. Obama viewed Traore as someone whose radical approach reflected inexperience rather than legitimate disagreement with democratic incrementalism. President Obama, Traore said, his voice remaining calm but taking on a steely quality, when you characterize my approach as reflecting inexperience, I think you're revealing something important about your assumptions regarding African leadership and political contexts. Obama looked taken aback, not having expected such a direct response to what he considered diplomatic guidance. You seem to assume that anyone who rejects Western-style institutional procedures must be naive or impatient, rather than considering the possibility that those procedures might be inappropriate for certain historical and structural contexts. The challenge was moving beyond policy disagreements to fundamental questions about cultural and intellectual assumptions. But more importantly, you're asking me to prioritize your theoretical concerns about democratic precedents over my people's concrete needs for healthcare, education, and economic dignity. President Obama, Traore continued, his voice gaining intensity, you call me inexperienced, but I would suggest that true leadership experience is measured by actual improvements in people's lives rather than years spent managing institutional constraints that prevent meaningful change. You're a misguided young revolutionary, Obama said, his diplomatic facade finally slipping completely, who mistakes good intentions for wisdom and confuses rapid implementation with sustainable transformation. The phrase, misguided young revolutionary, hung in the air like a physical presence, revealing Obama's fundamental dismissal of Traore's approach as inherently flawed regardless of its results. The audience shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they had just witnessed a significant escalation from respectful dialogue to personal dismissal. Obama's carefully maintained diplomatic composure had cracked, revealing the condescension that lay beneath his polished rhetoric about democratic institutions and incremental change. Several attendees exchanged glances, understanding that the former president had just committed a serious diplomatic error by personally attacking a sitting head of state in such dismissive terms. The characterization of Traore as misguided, and the emphasis on his youth revealed assumptions about African leadership that would have been problematic coming from any Western leader, but were particularly damaging coming from someone of Obama's stature. Traore sat perfectly still for several moments, allowing the weight of Obama's words to settle over the room. His expressi. The tension in the Georgetown auditorium was electric as Ibrahim Traore prepared to respond to Barack Obama's dismissive characterization of him as a misguided young revolutionary. The former president's diplomatic mask had completely slipped, revealing the condescension that lay beneath his polished rhetoric about democratic institutions and incremental change. President Obama, Traore continued with devastating calm, you called me young, as if that were somehow disqualifying for leadership. I'm curious about this emphasis on age, because it seems to suggest that wisdom is measured by years spent within systems rather than by actual achievements for the people we serve. His voice remained perfectly controlled, but the intellectual precision was surgical. I'm 34 years old, which means I represent the generation that has lived entirely under the consequences of the policies that older leaders implemented in Africa. I've seen firsthand how your preferred model of institutional reform and international cooperation has actually worked for African people. The generational framing was brilliant, positioning Traore not as inexperienced but as someone who understood the real-world impact of policies that Obama could only theorize about. You're 63, which means you came of age during the era when these institutions were being designed and implemented. You've spent decades working within systems that were created by and for people like you. Perhaps the question isn't whether I'm too young to understand governance, but whether you're too invested in failed systems to acknowledge their actual outcomes. The role reversal was stunning, turning Obama's age-based criticism into evidence that he might be too institutionally captured to recognize institutional failure. President Obama, let me address your characterization of me as a revolutionary, because I think you're using that term as if it's inherently problematic. But I would ask you to consider what alternatives exist when existing systems consistently fail to serve people's needs. Traore stood slowly, commanding the complete attention of everyone in the auditorium. You celebrated the American civil rights movement, but that movement succeeded precisely because it was revolutionary. It didn't work within existing institutions, it challenged those institutions fundamentally. Martin Luther King didn't achieve change by accepting institutional constraints. He achieved change by making those constraints unsustainable through direct action, civil disobedience, and moral pressure that forced institutional transformation. The historical parallel was devastating because it used Obama's own example against his argument for institutional incrementalism. So when you criticize me for being revolutionary, you're essentially criticizing the same approach that created the opportunities that allowed you to become President of the United States. Obama was clearly struggling now, recognizing that his own political existence was the product of exactly the kind of revolutionary challenge to institutional power that he was now criticizing. But let's examine what you mean by misguided, Traore continued, his tone becoming more pointed. You seem to judge guidance by adherence to procedures rather than by outcomes for human welfare. Under your guidance philosophy, African leaders should accept international loan conditions that impoverish their people because those conditions come through proper institutional channels. We should maintain currency systems that enrich foreign banks because those systems have legal legitimacy. We should prioritize foreign corporate interests because those interests are represented through established diplomatic processes. Each example built toward a systematic indictment of the institutional approach that Obama was defending. President Obama, if being guided means accepting arrangements that consistently harm the people I represent, then I choose to be misguided. If wisdom means prioritizing procedural correctness over human dignity, then I choose to remain foolish. The moral authority behind his words was undeniable, creating a stark contrast with Obama's increasingly theoretical arguments. But let me challenge your fundamental assumption about sustainable change, Traore said, his voice gaining intensity. You suggest that revolutionary approaches are unsustainable while institutional approaches create lasting transformation. Yet the evidence suggests exactly the opposite. Your institutional approach to healthcare reform was partially reversed within a few years. Your financial regulations were weakened by subsequent administrations. Your climate policies were abandoned by your successor. Meanwhile, the revolutionary changes I've implemented, free healthcare, free education, nationalized industries, have created concrete improvements that cannot be easily reversed because they're supported by the people who benefit from them. The comparison was brutal because it highlighted that Obama's incrementalism had produced changes that were easily undone, while Traore's revolutionary approach had created more durable improvements. President Obama, you call my approach unsustainable, but which of us has actually created changes that improve people's daily lives? Which of us has built policies that serve human needs rather than institutional preferences? Obama was now visibly frustrated, his usual eloquence failing him as he struggled to defend abstract principles against concrete achievements. President Traore, Obama said, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation, you're cherry-picking examples and ignoring the broader complexities of governance in diverse, pluralistic societies. What you've achieved in Burkina Faso might work in a small, relatively homogeneous country, but it couldn't possibly scale to larger, more complex political systems with competing interests and institutional constraints. The response revealed Obama's fundamental assumptions about African political contexts and capabilities. Couldn't possibly scale? Traore repeated, his eyebrows rising. President Obama, are you suggesting that what works for African people in Burkina Faso couldn't work for American people in the United States? The question was simple but devastating, forcing Obama to either defend American exceptionalism or admit that his approach might be inferior to Traore's. Are you saying that Americans are somehow incapable of benefiting from free healthcare and education? Or are you saying that American institutions are so captured by elite interests that they cannot deliver basic human services that we've successfully provided in Africa? The systematic questioning was exposing the contradictions in Obama's position, highlighting that his defense of institutional constraints might actually be a defense of elite privilege. Because if small, homogeneous Burkina Faso can provide universal healthcare while large, diverse America cannot, perhaps the problem isn't with scaling revolutionary approaches but with the willingness of American leaders to challenge powerful interests that profit from human suffering. Obama's face was flushed now, clearly understanding that Traore was using his own arguments to expose the moral bankruptcy of accepting systemic injustice in the name of political realism. President Obama, Traore continued relentlessly, you spent 8 years as the most powerful leader in the world, with enormous resources and public support for change. Yet you consistently chose to work within constraints that prevented meaningful transformation. You compromised with pharmaceutical companies instead of implementing universal health care. You negotiated with Wall Street instead of restructuring an economy that serves financial elites rather than working people. You accepted military-industrial complex priorities instead of redirecting resources toward human development. And now you criticize me for refusing to accept similar constraints in Africa. You call me misguided for prioritizing human welfare over institutional preferences. The systematic dismantling was complete, and Obama was clearly struggling to formulate any response that didn't sound like he was defending the prioritization of elite interests over human needs. This isn't about being anti-American or anti-institutional, Traore concluded, his voice taking on a tone of genuine disappointment. This is about whether leaders have the courage to serve their people's actual needs rather than the institutional arrangements that benefit from those needs not being met. President Obama, you had the opportunity to be truly revolutionary, to use American power to create genuine change not just for Americans but for people around the world. Instead, you chose to be a maintenance manager for systems that perpetuate inequality and injustice. You call me a misguided young revolutionary as if that's an insult. But I would rather be a misguided revolutionary who delivers healthcare and education to my people than a wise institutional leader who delivers eloquent speeches while people continue to suffer. The contrast was perfect, highlighting the difference between rhetoric and results, between institutional sophistication and human welfare. The question isn't whether I'm too young or too revolutionary or too misguided for your approval. The question is whether you're too invested in failed systems to recognize that they've failed. As Traore concluded his response, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause that went on for several minutes. Students and faculty were on their feet, many visibly moved by what they had witnessed. Obama sat in stunned silence, his legendary rhetorical skills having proven completely inadequate against someone who combined philosophical sophistication with concrete achievements. The former president who had built his career on inspiring hope for change had just been systematically outmaneuvered by someone who had actually delivered change. The misguided young revolutionary had just given the elder statesman of American politics a masterclass in the difference between talking about transformation and actually achieving it. As the applause continued, it became clear that the audience had witnessed something unprecedented in international diplomacy. A sitting African president had not merely defended his policies against criticism from a former American president, he had systematically dismantled the entire intellectual framework underlying Western approaches to African development. The standing ovation seemed to go on forever, with students particularly energized by Traore's articulation of generational politics and revolutionary change. Many were clearly struck by his reframing of youth as an asset rather than a liability, and his challenge to the assumption that institutional experience was more valuable than concrete achievements. Obama remained seated, his expression a mixture of shock and barely concealed anger. The former president who had built his global reputation on eloquent advocacy for hope and change had just been thoroughly outclassed by someone who had actually delivered hope and change to his people. Several faculty members were already taking notes, understanding that they had just witnessed a historic moment that would be studied in political science and international relations courses for decades. The exchange represented a fundamental challenge to Western liberal assumptions about democracy, development, and the relationship between procedures and outcomes. Are there other questions? The moderator asked uncertainly, clearly recognizing that any attempt to continue the planned format would be anticlimactic after what they had just witnessed. But before anyone could respond, Obama stood up abruptly, his composure completely shattered. "I think we've heard enough revolutionary rhetoric for one evening," he said, his voice carrying an edge of bitterness that surprised everyone present. The comment was clearly intended as a dismissive exit line, but it only served to highlight how thoroughly Traore had gotten under Obama's skin. The former president, who prided himself on maintaining grace under pressure, had been reduced to making petty comments that revealed his frustration and embarrassment. "President Obama," Traore said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium, "I think the audience deserves better than having this dialogue end with dismissive rhetoric about revolutionary approaches." Obama paused at the edge of the stage, clearly torn between his desire to leave and his recognition that walking away would look even worse than staying to defend his position. "If you'd like to engage with the substance of what I've said rather than dismissing it as rhetoric, I'm happy to continue."